Tonight I've entitled the message, Gather the Fragments. Why should we gather the fragments? Because Jesus commanded it. Whatever he's told us to do, that's what we need to do. And this is one of them. You are familiar with the story, I'm sure. It's actually in all four Gospels, but in John 6, 12 and 13 it says, "When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore, they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten." Now you have to think about this a little bit. I don't believe it was pieces of bread that somebody else had chewed on. But as Jesus took those 5 loaves and kept breaking off pieces, there was enough left over to fill these 12 baskets. And Jesus made a special point that we're not going to waste these 12 baskets of bread. We're going to make use of them. Later, in Mark 8, 19 and 20, he asked his disciples, and he adds another occasion, "When I break the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? They say unto him, 12. And when the 7 among 4,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they said, 7. Does that give you the understanding that Jesus always did this? He did not waste anything. And so on both occasions, he gave the same command and saved what would have been wasted. And I don't know what the habits of people were back then, but I suppose some of them had similar habits to today, that they would have just thrown it on the ground or whatever, because after all, they figure if we get in this situation again, Jesus can just make some more. And you know, there's an awful lot of waste in this country today. And there's an awful lot of waste in the church. And there's an awful lot of waste in God's institutions. And so this, I believe, is a very important lesson. And I thank God that we had to learn that lesson. I don't believe we were the most wasteful people when we came to self-supporting work. But we found out that we were more wasteful than what we needed to be. And our habits had to change. People told us at first we only came to be here 6 months. And we were going to go on our way. Next year, we're going to celebrate our 50th year in self-supporting work. But we got a little nervous because people said to us, "You won't be able to stay here if you don't have savings." And we didn't have anything except we did have $600 when we arrived, but we expected to spend that on tuition. So they said, unless you had a house that you sold or you've got a savings or you got an extra source of income, you won't be able to stay. And by that time, we were really liking it. And so we thought, well, maybe we'll end up having to leave. But we never did. For 49 years, we've never had to leave because of that. But we did have to learn to gather up the fragments. Commenting upon this in Adventist Home, page 381, we read this. Christ once gave his disciples a lesson upon economy, which is worthy of careful attention. That's what we're doing tonight. Giving careful attention to this statement that Jesus made, and why did he make this statement, and what is the purpose of this statement for us, especially here in this place. He wrought a miracle to feed the hungry thousands who had listened to his teachings. Yet, after all had eaten and were satisfied, he did not permit the fragments to be wasted. Notice that? He did not permit that to be wasted. He who could, in their necessity, feed the vast multitude by his divine power, bade his disciples gather up the fragments that nothing might be lost. How much be lost? Nothing. Now, here's a key sentence. This lesson was given as much for our benefit as for those living in Christ's day. So he didn't just tell it for the people of that day, but he told it for everybody that would live afterward, and especially the last generation. If we expect to take the gospel to the world in one generation, which is how it always happens, if it goes to the world, it goes in one generation. If we expect to take the gospel to the world in one generation, we have to learn this lesson, because it takes a lot of money to accomplish that, to take it in one generation. And if we waste, there won't be enough money to do it, even though God has lots of money, but it won't happen. So this lesson was given as much for our benefit as for those living in Christ's day. The Son of God has a care for the necessities of temporal life. He cares whether there's enough money for people to have a decent diet. He cares whether people starve to death or not. The Son of God has a care for the necessities of temporal life. He did not neglect the broken fragments after the feast, although he could make such a feast whenever he chose. You know, rich people can throw away lots of food and they can think, well, I can buy more. But poor people, if they waste, they may not have a meal, or they may not have a very good meal. And so in some ways, poor people are better off than rich people, because they have to learn not to waste. Also, Adventist Psalm 381 goes on to say, the lessons of Jesus Christ are to be carried into every phase of practical life. Now, that's not the only area, but that's the one we're going to talk about for a while. Every phase of practical life we must learn economy in it. Economy is to be practiced in all things. Gather up the fragments that nothing be lost. There is a religion that does not touch the heart and therefore becomes a form of words. Maybe some here tonight are like that. Because if I asked, how many people have heard the story of feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000, and you knew that Jesus gathered up the fragments, but how many have neglected to carry it out in your practical life? You see, that's the problem. Information in the head doesn't translate into action. But that's not real religion. Real religion, when we hear a principle, it gets carried out in the practical life. There is a religion, but you don't want it, that does not touch the heart and therefore becomes a form of words. It is not brought into the practical life. Religious duty and the highest human prudence in business lines must be commingled. I have heard that 50% of businesses go out of business. They go bankrupt. Now, I have no statistics, but I would venture to say that the vast majority of businesses that failed because they did not practice this principle. If they had, they would have been able to make it successfully. So, even the highest prudence in business, and in this work, we have to run businesses in order to support ourselves. We basically teach that we don't get donations to take care of our needs, that we earn that ourselves. And in order to do that, we have to understand and practice this prudence in business lines. One of the areas which comes from the story is food. Adventist Home 377, our economy must never be of that kind which would lead to providing meager meals. God wants us to have balanced meals. He wants us to have what looks tasty and, we want to eat. He doesn't want meager meals. However, students should have an abundance of wholesome food, but let those in charge of the cooking gather up the fragments that nothing be lost. So the cook, as well as those who eat the meals, have a responsibility not to waste. We noticed, as we were watching the habits of the young people eating there at Youth for Jesus, that they would take a lot of food on their plate, they would get full, they couldn't eat it all, and in the trash it went. One day, after I talked to them about it, we had a very interesting experience that happened. There was a very tasty fruit salad. Very tasty fruit salad. I got some of it before it was empty. But one of the students took a bowl of it, and I guess he decided he was too full or some other interest, he didn't want to eat it, so he dumped it in the trash. And so one of the other young people who went to the bowl when it was empty, and they couldn't get any because it was already gone, they said, "You dumped that in the trash? I would have eaten that." Now, he hadn't even started on it, You might not want to eat it after somebody tasted it, but he was really upset with him for that. So we were praising God for the cook we had, though. That was Samay. And she didn't let any leftovers go to waste. She put everything back around in some way that was tasty. And the food budget for feeding that many people was incredibly small by comparison to what it could have been. Quite a sum may be expended in hotel. Now, notice I put the word restaurant there, and you'll see why in a minute. Quite a sum may be expended in hotel bills that are not at all necessary. The cause of God lay so near the heart of the pioneers in this message that they seldom took a meal at a hotel, even though the cost was but 25 cents each. Now, I had a little guilty conscience when I read that one and put it in the sermon tonight, because one of the pastors wanted to treat us all to a restaurant. And he picked, as far as restaurants go, he picked a pretty economical restaurant. But to treat all of us to the restaurant was $269. And as I read this quotation, I said, I should have talked to him about what that $269 could have done in advancing God's cause, rather than to blow it on one meal for a bunch of people. But you know, restaurants are getting very popular for people to go to restaurants. And if you've had to pioneer, which many have not, that's probably why so much money gets spent on restaurants. But if you had to pioneer, the pioneers said, we can't blow that much on one meal. We can't do that. And so even though it was only 25 cents, they wouldn't spend it in the restaurant. And by the way, you may get sick from eating in the restaurant because they don't live by the same standards we do. They don't cook by the same standards we do. Oh, you might not get sick the next day, but down later in your life, you may have something that comes on you because of it. So there's more than one reason why that isn't the best practice for us as Seventh-day Adventists. Here's another big one, Child Guidance, page 135. Men who might today be occupying high positions in connection with the work of God have failed because they never learned to economize. I've seen that here at Wildwood. People come, they don't learn to economize, their savings runs out, and they have to leave. That's not true just here. I believe this is a big problem in the call porter work. You know, the call porter work is falling apart as far as from what it used to be in my younger years. And the reason, one of the reasons it's falling apart is the call porter can't live on what he sells. But if he could live on whatever he sells, he could keep doing it. He would have to learn to economize, though. And there's many other aspects where that would make people able to work for God instead of having to go out to do something else. It gives the reason here. They did not limit their wants to their incomes. See, that's the principle. How much your income is, that's how much you live on. That's the practice that we have practiced for the 49 years. And sometimes our income was really small. We got $10 a month for a stipend for about 8 years. Only problem was they could give it only half of the time. Now, a dollar was worth a little more back then, but that's what we had to live on. And we had $15 per person in food budget, but they can only give that half of the time. So we got $75 per year for food budget. But, you know, God made it stretch, and we didn't go in debt, and we didn't have to leave. They did not limit their wants to their incomes when they entered the work, and their spendthrift habits proved the ruin of their usefulness in the cause. So there is a very important thought. 4th Testimonies 5:72. This is the duty of all, that is, to be gathering up the fragments. And those who occupy a leading position should set the example. Now, I got a blessing just recently while we were up there in Louisville. The shoes that I normally wear were getting pretty worn, but I didn't want to pay full price for a pair of shoes. And while I was there, we walked into Walmart, and they had $30 pair of shoes, really comfortable shoes, $5 a piece. Counsels on Stewardship 269. By precept and example, parents should teach their children the science of making a small amount go as far as possible. Why? Many poor families are poor because they spend their money as soon as they receive it. So God is saying, that's not the best way to live. If you will stretch what you have as far as it will go, you will have some left over, and you'll be able to either have some things that you should have that you can't have now, or you'll be able to do good with that extra money. And Child Guidance 135, nothing that can be utilized should be thrown away. Now, there are some people that save things that have no use to anybody. That's not the best plan either. But if it can benefit somebody, it should not be thrown away. I hope you don't think ill of me, but I have gotten a number of pretty nice things at the dump. Not lately, however. I think it's being watched better, but in the past I have. This will require wisdom and forethought and constant care. It has been presented to me that the inability to save in little things is one reason why so many families suffer for the lack of the necessities of life. Imagine that. Due to not learning the lesson of gathering up the fragments, people have to do without things that God calls necessities, things that we really need, but we can't have it because we're wasting. And when people do that, you know what? A lot of other people say, I'm not going to help them. Look how much they waste. And you wonder, well, how come nobody's helping me? But that's not really the best plan. We should help people have the necessities of life, even if they waste. But we also need to teach them to stop wasting. Another thing I had to lecture the students on up there, but I'm not sure they really paid enough attention. The place where we're staying had doors that you could unlock it, but when you went out and came back, it was locked again. And so they would open the door wide and prop it open there with the air conditioning just, going out the door. And I gave them a lecture about the need to put something real small. If you're afraid the door is not going to open for you when you come back, put something real small at the door so it's almost closed and yet you can get in. When I got back, it's still propped wide open. But, I don't know what the bill's going to be for that. They're going to take it out of our budget, which they should do. Fifth Testimonies 399 and 400. Economy is needed in every department of the Lord's work. So if we went department by department, we'd probably find this is true. The natural turn of youth in this age is to neglect and despise economy. Now, I'm afraid there's some older ones too, but it says that it's a special problem of the youth. And when we talk about economy, many young people are not interested or even despise economy. Why? And to confound it with stinginess and narrowness. But economy is consistent with the most broad and liberal views and feelings. There can be no true generosity where it is not practiced. We can't give until our own basic needs are taken care of. So if we spend everything we have on meeting our basic needs, we have nothing to give. And that's the way some people think about it. They think, well, the pay is so low at Wildwood, I can't give anything. And some even stop paying their tithe because they think they can't afford to pay their tithe. But the smaller the income, the more important to pay the tithe, because you need God's blessing more than the rich person. And so we never question the paying of tithe ever, no matter how tight we got. But sometimes you can't give if you're not really economical. No one should think it beneath him to study, notice that word, study economy. We won't know it all at once, how we can be gathering up the fragments. No one should think it beneath him to study economy and the best means of taking care of the fragments. In the Medical Ministry 176, money is a needed treasure. In this old world, if you don't have money, you can't do much of anything. Money is necessary. It's a necessary evil, perhaps, but it is necessary. So, since it is a needed treasure, let it not be lavished on those who do not need it. Now, I'll tell you right now, don't give me any gifts. I don't need it. Give it to somebody that needs it. And this is calling us to stop giving gifts to people that don't need it. Now, of course, some little thing that shows our appreciation of them that's not very expensive at all, that's condoned, especially at Christmas time, it mentions that. But to spend lots of money giving gifts to people that don't need it, that's not God's plan for us. Someone needs your willing gifts. Too often, those who have means fail to consider how many in the world are hungry, starving for food. So we have a calling to help those that don't have enough to eat. And they're not all far away either. Publishing Ministry 105 brings another area to light. Gather up the fragments. But this time it says, waste not the minutes in talking. Wasted minutes mar the hours. When we waste time, we stop the earning that we could earn if we're thinking about money. But also, he wants us to gather up the fragments of time to save souls and to speak to people about salvation. And so this is also gathering up the fragments. It's not just in the area of money. It's a much broader topic than that. Also, Publishing Ministry 283, as Christ was careful to instruct the disciples to gather up the fragments, so we should treasure every fragment of literature containing the truth for this time. Literature gets thrown out. Now, there used to be some folks at Wildwood that would gather up the Sabbath School Quarterlies and they would send a package to Africa or someplace. This is the kind of thing it's talking about. Don't waste literature. There's somebody somewhere that needs that literature. Same book, 331, stop every leak. Mind the little things. It is the little losses that tell heavily in the end. Look after the littles. Gather up the fragments. For many who look after the larger matters have never learned to guard and save the trifles. They say, it's only a nickel. Well, that one's passed. They say it's only $1. It's only a quarter. And so they don't bother to worry about that. Now here's a very interesting one for those of us that are here at the institution, 4th Testimonies 451. Losses occur from lack of thoughtful care in the use of material and machinery. How many times the institution has to buy a new one because the old one got destroyed by lack of carefulness? And you know, I've noticed this through the years, that if you have a vehicle or you have a piece of equipment that a lot of different people use, it'll be torn up way faster because of that. However, if everybody was careful, it wouldn't happen. But because there's so many people that are not careful, the machinery gets torn up or the material gets wasted. There is a failure to look after all the larger and smaller matters, that nothing be wasted or damaged through, and here's an important word, neglect. It's too much bother to save that, or to be careful with that, or to put in the time it takes to have a savings for the institution. A little squandered here and there amounts to a large sum in the course of a year. If there was any way we could add it up, it would be shocking how much got wasted. Some have never learned to exercise their faculties to save the remnants, notwithstanding the injunction of Christ, gather up the fragments. Now here's a practical suggestion. Material should not be slashed into to obtain a small piece. You have a piece of plywood, 4 by 8. Somebody needs a small piece, so they cut in, and the rest, well, maybe it gets used, maybe not. A little thoughtful care would lead to the gathering up and using of the little pieces that are now thrown aside and wasted. I once saw a man that ran a whole business based on the scraps that some woodworking company threw out. A little thoughtful care would lead to the gathering up and using of the little pieces that are now thrown aside and wasted. Attention should be given to saving even so trifling a matter as waste paper, for it can, I think is, I left off to see, can be turned into money. Well, paper's kind of low right now, but it's true. You can get some money. You can either spend it putting it in the dumpster, or you can get money by putting it to the right place. And there's something else that's a lot more valuable than paper, and that's cardboard. Have you noticed how that America runs on cardboard? But it can be taken in, and we used to have people that would do that and take in the cardboard and get a lot of money over time for that. 5th Testimonies 4:13. Suppose this happened at Wildwood. What would the prophet see? I have passed through the office and have been shown how the angels of God look upon the work done in the various rooms. In some, the condition of things is better than in others, but, and I was interested in this word, but in all. In other words, there was not a single department. But in all, there are wrongs that might be remedied. Loss is seen in many departments. The reckless way that many work results in loss to the office and is an offense to God. It is sad that it should be thus. Well, God is still looking, and there's no living prophet right now to tell us what God saw, but we can recognize in these records that it's very likely that the same things are going on. May God help us to care enough to try to correct it. Now, we've been at it for a long time, and so we can probably see what other people waste easier. But, you don't have to live by our standard. God is wanting you to learn. Take a step at a time and learn until you also understand how to not waste. In closing, I want to shift to the spiritual, though, because it's not just in the practical areas of life. Desire of Ages 368. The lesson was twofold. Nothing is to be wasted. We are to let slip no temporal advantage. And that's what we've been talking about. Not waste any temporal advantage. That $1, that $10, that $50 can benefit somebody. We should neglect nothing that will tend to benefit a human being. Let everything be gathered up that will relieve the necessity of earth's hungry ones. And there should be the same carefulness in spiritual things. Now, you have opportunity as you leave this place tonight. Will you forget what you heard here tonight? If so, you're wasting the fragments. God wants us not to waste any spiritual advantage that we have. And there should be the same carefulness in spiritual things. Not one word that concerned their eternal salvation was to fall useless to the ground. And that's true in all the spiritual classes that any of you have, that God does not want us to let one concept, one principle fall to the ground without taking root in our heart and accomplishing what it's supposed to. But I'm afraid there's a lot of wasting of the fragments in the spiritual realm as well. Seventh Bible Commentary 984. When we gather up the fragments of light, when we appreciate the sure mercies of God, who loves to have us trust Him, then every promise will be fulfilled. And that is in the setting of the latter rain. So we have some getting ready to do. We have to get ready not to waste any temporal blessing that God has given us, not to waste any spiritual blessing that He tries to give us. And when we measure up to that, we are going to receive not just many, but every promise that He gave us is going to be fulfilled to us. And in one generation, less really than one generation, the gospel is going to go to the entire world. There will be no lack of money to accomplish it because people have learned what we're talking about tonight, and they're able to give liberally. They're able to share the light that God has given them liberally, and God's work is finished in a very short time. May God help us to take what I've shared with you tonight seriously. Now, if you feel that your toes have been stepped on, you can know that it was not on purpose, that I did that. But it was out of the benefits of the experience that we have had that I would like to see many more people have the blessing. We never had to say, how much will you pay us to go there? Never. Because we learn how to stretch the money. And some places where you can work, you won't get much. And God doesn't want us to have to turn it down because of the small income. The work needs done. Some colporteurs have tough territory. They don't sell very much. But they could exist if they learn this blessing. And so may God help us to be able to learn all that we need to learn on this.